We thank you again for being here with us this afternoon. This is such an important topic that we are really happy to cover. We'll be talking this afternoon about what mentees need to know about substance use. Next slide, Jess. Oh, I am Wendy Mill. I'm with the Governor's Prevention Partnership. I'm a program coordinator. I'll be your moderator for today's conversation. A quick disclaimer here, similar as the one you heard earlier, that the views expressed today are not necessarily those of the participants and may not necessarily represent those of the Governor's Prevention Partnership. The information provided is meant solely for educational purposes, and the Governor's Prevention Partnership is not liable for any outcomes related to the implementation of materials presented here today. Just a few housekeeping items. We do ask that you do remain muted and to silence your cell phones for the duration of our presentation. Today's session will run for approximately 45 minutes, and it is being recorded to be hosted on our website for potential future use. There will be an opportunity for question and answers after the presentation, but do please feel free to use the chat liberally. We'll be monitoring that for questions, and we'll take them as we go as well. So now for our featured speaker today, I am so excited to present my colleague, Jessica White. Jessica is a program manager here at the Governor's Prevention Partnership, and she brings to her work a wealth of knowledge and experience in the fields of youth development and in education. Her professional experiences include working with youth-serving nonprofit agencies and developing programs to help youth grow and thrive through school and during out-of-school hours. Jessica holds a master's of education and is an active Connecticut certified teacher. Jessica, thanks for sharing your information with us today. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Wendy. I'm very happy to be here. I also want to start and just share a little bit about the Governor's Prevention Partnership in case you are new to our organization or not familiar with the work that we do. So the partnership is a statewide agency in Connecticut that works to enhance the youth prevention and mentoring frameworks. We do this by offering training, technical assistance, and other collaborative approaches where we seek to bring people together, and we want to connect programs, people, and communities to the resources that they need to positively affect the lives of Connecticut's youth. So today in our time together, we're going to cover three main topics. We'll start by looking at some of the current trends in youth substance use. We'll learn about the four most common substances that young people experiment with. Then we'll talk a little bit about teens today in their world. We'll talk about why teens are developmentally primed to take risks and do things such as experiment with substances. And then finally, we'll end our time together by talking about some tips for starting the conversations with young people about drugs and substance use. So through our time today, I will be sure to keep an eye on the chat and the question and answer feature as well. So feel free to jump in at any time if you have a question, and I'll do my best to take some time throughout and answer the questions as they come up. But we also should have some time at the end to be able to go through any questions that are, comments that come up at that time as well. So what you see on your screen are some of the rates of consumption as of 2019 for high school age youth in Connecticut. So you can see the four most common substances that young people might experiment with alcohol largely thought of as the most common and the most prevalent. That's usually one of the first substances that young people, if they choose to, experiment or try any substances, alcohol tends to be one of the first. We also have vaping and electronic cigarette products that are growing in popularity still with our young people. You can see the rates of use in Connecticut, which this refers to past 30-day use. Is even slightly higher for vaping products than it is for alcohol, but only about 1 percentage point difference. And then we also look at cannabis, which we'll talk a little bit about. In Connecticut, just last year, we legalized adult use cannabis in our state. So that is definitely going to have implications for the availability and the access of our young people as well. And then finally, we look at prescription pill misuse. And the rates you see there actually refer to lifetime use. So those are young people reporting that at any point in their life, they had misused a prescription pill. It just means taking it some way other than how a doctor had prescribed it, or taking a prescription that was prescribed for somebody else. So we're going to take a little bit of a deep dive into some of these and talk a little bit more about these substances and the information that we need to know. So first is vaping, which on your screen you can see some of the different iterations of vapes and the e-cigarettes and what they look like. There's tanks or mods where portions of these will open up and you can put either cartridges in there, or sometimes even cannabis flower. Vaping cannabis is something that's becoming popular as well. Then you have rechargeable e-cigarettes, which are products like the Juul. These look like highlighters. They often can look like things that are not e-cigarettes, that look like more everyday office supply type of things. And then lastly, we also have disposable e-cigarettes, which are actually taking over in popularity as being the #1 product that young people are turning to for e-cigarettes right now. So looking at rates of use in Connecticut in 2019, we had about 44% of young people say that they had ever tried an electronic vapor product, with 27% of those being current users, which means that they had used within the last 30 days. And comparing those numbers to the number of youth who report smoking are the traditional combustible cigarettes, which is down to 3.7%. So a lot of progress had been made in recent decades at driving that number down and getting young people to turn away from tobacco products and stop using them. And unfortunately, we've seen a little bit of reversal with that, with the advent of e-cigarettes. So we know that part of, related to this issue is that there is a lot of direct marketing and direct advertising on behalf of the vaping companies to young people in particular, right, to adolescents. There are certainly incentives, and we know things like nicotine are contained in these products. That is a highly addictive substance. So that's where their incentive for having younger people using their products, because then they become lifelong customers. Thankfully, in recent years, the FDA has started to push back on this a little bit, and we've seen them institute some bans on flavored tobacco products. However, there are pretty big loopholes that still exist in some of those bans, and 2 of them are on your screen right now. One of them being refillable pods. So these are brands like Smoke. And again, you can see the appeal to young people here, where the products, the devices have fun patterns on them. They have colors and things like that that appeal to young people. So the refillable pods are one loophole, and then disposable e-cigarettes were another product that was not included in the flavored tobacco ban. So this is important because we know that up to 85% of young people who say that they regularly use vape products say that the appeal is about the flavors, right? And that they probably wouldn't use the product if the flavor varieties weren't available to them, that it wouldn't have the same appeal and draw that it does. So we think that we can make a lot of progress by, doing things like banning the flavored tobacco products. The other important thing to note about these are, I think, a talking point that often works with young people. Many young people, Generation Z, are very motivated by environmental issues and climate change. And these disposable e-cigarettes and the other products are only contributing to the problem of trash and garbage that's impacting our environment. These all have batteries in them. They're made of plastic components that don't go away, that become single-use plastics and eventually end up in landfills as well. So there's more incentive, even beyond the harmful effects on your own body and your health. Using products like this can also be detrimental to the environment as well. Next up, we're going to talk a little bit about cannabis. So as I had mentioned, last year in Connecticut, following a trend of legalization across the country, Connecticut formally legalized adult use cannabis in our state. So one of the expected consequences of this is that, there's going to be more products available, that young people will have more access to cannabis and cannabis products because now it's readily available in retail stores. Right? You can expect people to have more of it in their home than they did prior to legalization. On top of that, we've also been seeing things such as the perception of harm of smoking cannabis decreasing. And this is, again, a lot of it is because of the legalization that's been happening in the country, that there's a lot more talk in the media about how these products and how the substances impact people. And we're seeing that have an impact on how our young people perceive this. So the stats that are on your screen, in just 5 years from 2015 to 2020, the number of young people who said that they perceived it to be harmful to smoke cannabis once or twice a week declined by almost 10 percentage points. So that's not a very long amount of time for that kind of decrease to happen. So when we're seeing a decrease in perception of harm with an increase in availability and access, which is what's happening with legalization, right, it's expected that that can have an impact on the number of young people that are experimenting or using these substances and drugs, which is something that we certainly want to address and pay attention to. So with the legalization that's happened, there's a lot of new varieties and products that are available on the market today. An important thing to note about this, right, there's often the perception that cannabis is natural, that it's safe because it comes from a plant. People have been smoking it and using it for generations and for years and years. However, the cannabis that exists today and that's often on the market today is a lot different than what was available even just a couple decades ago. To begin, the THC potency that is found commonly has really jumped in the last couple of decades. So in the 1990s, the DEA reported that the flower cannabis that they were finding on the streets had about 4% THC typically. But by 2018, they found the THC potency increased to about 15%. So that's just your normal everyday bud that is being sold on the illicit market is around 15%. The products that are available in dispensaries and retail stores, oftentimes the potency is even higher, around 20% or even more from there. Researchers and scientists who study cannabis and the impacts of cannabis think of anything above 10% THC potency as a high potency product. So that just tells you that, right, even like sort of the bottom shelf, so to speak, of what you would think of, right, the lowest levels of what's typically available, even those are very high potency products. So in addition to the bud that you often see, there are newer products called cannabis concentrates, which I'll talk more about in a moment, but those are pictured on your screen. And those can have even higher levels of THC potency, up to 60 to 80% for some of them. So smoking is by far the most common way to consume cannabis. So we're talking about, using pipes, smoking joints, blunts, things like that. We are seeing more and more teens reporting that they're vaping cannabis. Some statistics to illustrate that in 2013, 1.6% reported that they have vaped cannabis. But just 7 years later, by 2020, that number increased almost fourfold to 8.5%, 8.4%, saying that they had vaped cannabis in the last 30 days. So this is connected to often the perception that vaping is safer or less harmful than traditional smoking methods. You might be able to find some statistics that can show that it's safer than that. However, that doesn't mean that it's a safe product, right? There's still a lot of danger and risk that is involved in that. It can do damage not only to your brain consuming those chemicals, but your respiratory system as well can be affected and have long-lasting implications. So another common and popular way to ingest or to consume cannabis is through edibles and oral ingestion. Some of the things to be aware of with this and some of the risks that can be associated are that it's often difficult to discern what the serving size of it is. If you think of a candy bar that is infused with THC, typically a serving size of that is going to be one little bar, right? One small piece of that chocolate bar. Whereas, to sit and eat a whole Hershey bar, just a regular chocolate bar in one sitting is not a big deal. But considering that a serving size is just a fraction of that when it's an edible, when it's a THC candy bar, that's not something that we can expect young people to just be aware of and to just know all of the time. So the risk for consuming too much and for overdosing is very prevalent, and it's there. The other factor with this is that there is delayed onset of the effects when you're consuming edibles. So compared to smoking, which you typically start to feel the effects of that within minutes, it can take 30 up to 2 hours, sometimes 30 minutes or up to 2 hours for people to start to feel the effects of edibles when they've ingested them. So coupled with uncertainty about serving size and things like that, this just makes the potential for overdose and for consuming too much, especially for young people who are less aware of their boundaries, less aware of limitations and things like that. It just makes it more of a risky activity for them than it was in the past. And then lastly, another form of consuming cannabis that is important for us to talk about is cannabis concentrates, which is also known as dabbing. So dabbing can come in a couple of different forms shown on your screen. As I said before, the final product can have a potency of 40 to 80% THC, and the high can also last for up to 24 hours. So, these are very potent products. And again, when we see some of the worst consequences come from consuming cannabis, it tends to be people who had consumed high potency products and had consumed a high amount of them as well. So there's definitely a lot of concern through that. Next, we'll talk briefly about prescription pills and opioids. So you can see on your screen some of the rates of use among youth in Connecticut. And what I really want to highlight for this is it unfortunately shows a discrepancy in rates of different populations that come through across a couple of different substances. So we see the total population in Connecticut, about 10% of high schoolers reported having misuse of prescription. But if we look at females, and in particular, if we look at LGBTQ youth, we see the rates increase much more. So females, and especially youth who identify as LGBTQ, are at increased risk for substance consumption. And I think it's really worthwhile to look at these and to drill down a little bit more in this and know that we have to give some sort of customized interventions and attention that really speaks to the unique experience of those groups that puts them at higher risk for using these substances. I see the time, so I'm going to speed through this a little bit to get to some of the other stuff. Important things to know about this: while most teens do report that they get prescription pills they have used from either friends or family members, social media is becoming an increasingly popular way for young people to access really any kind of drug, but pills in particular. And the DEA is reporting that they are finding more and more pills that are counterfeit and contain lethal doses of fentanyl in them. So it could be that somebody thinks they're taking something such as a Vicodin or a Percocet, but in reality, what they have is a pill that has fentanyl in it. And this is driving a lot of the increases in overdoses that we're seeing across the country. In the interest of time, I'm actually going to skip this short video. It's just like a minute long, but we can talk about the stuff in the next slide. So we're going to start just talking a little bit about adolescents and what makes them, at such great risk to experiment with substances, and why are there higher consequences for youth substance use than there might be for adults doing the same thing. And a lot of the reason comes down to where they are in their development. We know that there's a lot of physical development happening during adolescence. Identity development is another piece of that, where young people are really trying to figure out, who am I? They are more driven by social comparisons, right, and reinforcement from their peers. So we find one of the things that the video talked about is that the dopamine that gets released when adolescents are with their peers and doing things is greater than what gets released when they're maybe just with their family, right? So there's more reinforcement to take risks and to try new things when they're with peers versus with family members. So again, this puts them at a higher risk for making maybe not so good decisions and experimenting with things like drugs or other risky behavior. Additionally, adolescence is a huge time for brain development, and I find this is another effective talking point with young people too, that this is very sort of science driven about what's happening to their brains during this time. And I'll talk more about this in the next slides, but one of the reasons this is so important and what we think is connected to this is that we know 90% of addictions start in the teenage years. And much of it is because of the neural connections that are not only being established during this time, but really strengthened and solidified. So we can think of a young adolescent brain kind of like looking like this highway, which each of these paths representing a different neural connection that exists in the brain that's helping your brain to access things like skills, memories, information that it needs to just live life and to thrive. So there's lots of different connections when you're young and growing into adolescence. But then as we move through adolescence and into adulthood, our brain starts to do something called pruning, where it starts to eliminate some of the connections that it doesn't need so much, and it strengthens the ones that it does use and access all the time. So to carry through this highway analogy, right, you have all of these like fast moving, skinny little pathways when you're an adolescent. And then when you reach adulthood, they get much thicker. Your brain wants to be more efficient. It strengthens the connections that it accesses the most. So the problem is taking substances during adolescence can lead the path to look something like this, where there's breakdowns in how well the path functions. You can't easily traverse from one side of that bridge to the other because the path has been destroyed. This is what substances in taking any kind of drugs during adolescence, when this brain is developing, this is what can happen. And these neural connections will sort of stay damaged like this. It affects the structure and the function of the brain well into adulthood. We know that the last part of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex. That's this part of your brain right here, which is responsible for things like decision making, weighing cause and effect, right? So knowing consequences of things. Impulse control comes from your executive functioning as well. So all of these things contribute to young people's ability to be able to make decisions. So I kind of talked about a lot of these pieces already. Brain development certainly influences young people's ability to make decisions, but we also look at things like community norms, which it would include their peers, family members, and sort of just the general environment that they live in, right? What is the makeup of their neighborhood that they live in? Are there a lot of alcohol stores and outlets available at that time? What do they see the grown-ups doing around them at the parks and other open public spaces? Media messages are another important piece to be aware of. What is the music and the TV shows that your young person is watching, and what messages are they getting from that? And I'm not suggesting that they should maybe have that stuff censored or can't watch anything, but just having alternate messages, right? And taking opportunities to help talk through maybe some of the concepts or things that they're seeing happening, so that they have a better understanding, that there's more context to it. So there's some risk and protective factors that either make it more or less likely that a young person might engage in risky behavior, including substance use. So these can exist at the individual level, the relationship level, community, or in society in general. And when we think about substance use in particular, there are specific sets of risk and protective factors that might influence substance use. So some of the risk factors that are connected to increased likelihood of substance use are a perception that drug use is tolerated, that the adults around them don't have those boundaries in place, academic failure, lack of attachment to school or other pro-social institutions, poor social skills, poor emotional regulation skills, association with drug abusing peers, And then on the flip side, there are also some protective factors in place that can help build resilience of young people and make it less likely that they might engage in substance use, such as strong positive family bonds, clear expectations and boundaries, success in school, involvement in pro-social activities such as sports, religion, clubs, or hobbies. This is important because mentors are well positioned to be able to help increase and strengthen some of the protective factors that mentees possess that make it less likely for them to engage in risky behavior, such as substance use. So things like emotional self-regulation, right? Calming yourself down, knowing how to manage stress, high self-esteem, good coping skills and problem-solving skills, clear expectations for behavior and values, support for development of interests or skills, positive norms, and lastly, feeling physical and psychological safety. These are all really powerful factors that a mentor is very well equipped to be able to connect to a young person and to support them to develop some of those characteristics that can insulate them and help to make them more resilient. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but how do we have this conversation, right? It's not an easy thing. It might feel a little awkward or uncomfortable to talk to young people about substance use. However, it's important to have the conversation, right? I can't encourage you enough that just, bringing it up, doing things like asking questions is a really good way to start it. So maybe you observe something, maybe you go to a movie with your mentee and there is a depiction of some kind of drug use in that movie. Well, that can be something that you can say like, hey, what did you think about that? Have you seen people at school engaging in behavior like that, or something like that? Just feel out what they already know and what their feelings are about it. And it's important that you remain judgment-free with the things that they share with you as well. That in many ways, substance use affects people's lives in very different ways and shows up in a lot of different ways. And sometimes there can be emotion or really heavy feelings. So just providing space for that to exist, right? That doesn't necessarily have to be good or bad, can be beneficial to helping young people process through some of that. And then lastly on this slide, just be explicit and clear with what your wishes are and what your desires are for how your mentee or your young person engages in that. Right, so it doesn't have to be shaming if you find out that maybe they had experimented with some substances, but still be sure to say, that's not a healthy thing for you to engage in. I want you to be able to grow up and to thrive, and I think that's something that might hold you back from that. So, I hope that you make a different decision in the future. Something along those lines where, it's not a moral failing or them being a bad person for experimenting. Where and when to talk about substance use. It really could be something that is sort of an informal engagement that happens. It doesn't have to be something that's a big to do or even really planned out. But conversations happening in small bits and pieces where you're sending a consistent message over time is going to be more effective than just, having one long conversation and then not talking about it again. And as I had mentioned before, also using teachable moments to start conversations. So looking for things in the media that you observe that you can make connections to, and just using those as sort of jumping off points for conversation. And then lastly, to learn what to say about substance use can be something else that people might stress about or worry about. But finding credible sources of information, such as the Surgeon General, the CDC, the National Institute on Drugs, are all good places to go for facts about how drugs can affect people. But also don't be afraid to talk about some lived experience, right? Talk about what might motivate people to use substances and what might motivate them not to use substances. But having these sort of balanced conversations and understanding these issues in a nuanced way can help young people to make better decisions about how they want to live their lives. And lastly, be sure to model healthy choices and be aware of your own behavior. So something like if you're with your mentee going out to dinner or lunch, might not be the time to order an alcoholic beverage, something like that. just being aware of even what you're talking about, and maybe examples of how you're coping with stress or how you cope with difficult situations in your life. Being sure to model healthy coping mechanisms for the young people can be really important to help them develop those skills as well. So what I'll leave you with is a list of additional resources and websites that you can go to. Many of them are connected directly to Connecticut, so they have local information and resources in there. And the 3 that are in orange on the bottom are designed specifically for a teen audience. So those might be good resources to explore along with your mentee or the young people in your life. And the information is presented in a way that's really accessible to them. And at the end of the day, showing up imperfectly and trying your best is better than not showing up at all. So thanks for all of the work that you do for our young people. It's greatly appreciated. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Wendy. I'm sorry, we're 2 minutes over the session here.
We thank you for hanging in there with us, Jessica. That was great information. Thank you so much for connecting the dots between what we're doing in mentoring and how that relates to prevention. I think that is such an important link, and I thank you so much for bringing that up to the table. As you leave the session today, you will see a link to a poll, and I'd really appreciate it if you would take a moment just to complete that for our feedback. It's very helpful to us in doing so. And with that, Jess, can we go to the next slide? The big thank you. We do have some the upcoming sessions here this afternoon, and we're looking forward to seeing you there. The plenary from 3:15 to 4:15 on everyday mentoring, and making every moment matter, because it truly, truly does. And then our final closing remarks, we'll hear once again reflections from Kermit Carolina. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. These are also some ways that you can reach us here at the partnership, and we would welcome any feedback from you. If there's any way we can help support you, please don't hesitate to reach out to anyone on our staff. So thanks again for being here. Any questions, we're open to them. We're going to hang here for a few moments afterward, and we'll be looking for you this afternoon. Thanks again.